I want to start off by showing you some footage, actually, and we'll talk about this, of course, to Ben Habib, anything we're discussing, but I want to talk to you about it as well. But we will show you some footage in a minute or two, and that is of this protest that took place from these pro-Palestine protesters.
It wasn't a protest. It was an act of vandalism.
Well, in their mind, it was a protest. You're quite right. It was an act of vandalism. These pro-Palestine protesters destroying this historic painting. I don't think it's the original, but it's a reproduction of the original, but it's still historic. It's been there many years. In Trinity College in the University of Cambridge, by spraying and then slashing the picture. The picture is of Lord Balfour. Of course, Lord Balfour it was involved in essentially the formation of Israel, which is why that was the painting that was picked. Firstly, your reaction to that footage, but secondly, I wonder whether we need to now start having a conversation here in the UK about the obligation when it comes to social media companies, because I can't help but wonder. I was looking at some of the comments yesterday, actually. I'd love to say that I'd come up with this idea, but I didn't. But I was looking at a lot of the comments and reactions yesterday to this, and it reminded me of Just Stop Oil. It reminded me of many of the stunts that take place when it comes to a lot of these protests and paint being daubed over things and everything else. And of course, in the age of social media, it gives the immediate publicity that many of these people want. And sometimes it's for a good cause. Sometimes a limited amount of protest, I think, is absolutely fine. But when it's continual and when it's done just for clicks, is there an obligation for social media companies to stop showing this? Is there an obligation for social media companies to stop sharing this? Is there an obligation if this is being found to be something that is being done just for the clicks you get on social? Should social media companies step in and make sure that these kinds of scenes are deleted? 0344 499 1000. Or does that then make protesting more difficult? Does that then undermine your democratic right to protest? And as much as we might not like some protests, that is part of living in a society. Free speech means that sometimes you hear and see protests you don't like, but of course many of you will defend the right for people to protest. 0344 499 1000 is the number to call. Renee, what do you think? What do you think firstly about the act, and secondly, what do you think about the social media companies then allowing this act to be reshared?
Okay, so I think the act was summed up perfectly for me yesterday by Claire Fox, Baroness Claire Fox, who said it was no longer just performative Philistines. These are real-life, self-indulgent, nihilistic destroyers of art and history. What an insult. Narcissists hiding behind the Palestinian cause to indulge their own regressive, visceral culture war to declare that they are virtuous. And that's what this is. And, you know, destroying a painting, whatever the painting's relationship is with something that you don't agree with, is the next step to burning books. And we know what happened in the past when we started burning books. This is an outrageous attack on our culture and our history. I have every right to see that painting. That protest has every right not to go and see that painting. And that's not a protest stopping other people from making up their own minds. They're doing it for us.
Well, I roll my eyes a little bit at these sorts of things, because it was like the Colston statue.
Yes.
When that was taken down. And I was really in favour. I actually saw someone discussing that this week. It was Rafe. I forget what his surname is. People always think we look alike.
Yeah, similar.
People always say, "Oh my God, are you on TV?" And he was the historian, and he made a really good point about that statue, which was actually a step on from the point I normally make. So I normally say, right, if you don't like that statue, rather than ripping it down,
well, come by.
Put another plaque next to it, saying, actually, you know what, this was the old plaque that we had celebrating him. In 2021 or whatever year it was, the Black Lives Matter protests, made people refocus what they thought of it. Now the legacy of this person is is now more controversial than it used to be. We leave it here for you to make your own choice. Here's a QR code if you want to find out more information.
Yeah.
And look it up. And then it becomes what he suggested, actually, going a step further, was let's leave the statue up with the paint daubed all over it, thrown on it, and say, actually, look, and have a plaque saying this is what it used to look like with the photo. This is what it looks like now as a result of some of the protests. This is why this conversation needs to be had. And this is what the man's legacy was. Some of it good, some of it bad. So then, therefore, it becomes history. You're learning about history. And to go back to your point, you're not taking it away from anyone. I mean, that's a controversial view because obviously the statue gets ruined, but at least it's not being taken away.
But once again, Christo, we're focusing on one small part of what's going on in the world at the moment. There are plenty of Muslims being killed all over the world as we speak, or being held in concentration camps by the Chinese. If we look at America, I wonder if these children at this university, do they know how many Native Americans were killed by the English arriving and discovering it? 56 million in 100 years. Why are they still wearing a Mulberry handbag on their back as they protest about a war that's going on today and what somebody did in the past? Why are they not protesting against everything American? Why are they not ripping up everything that was American? They're stupid little children.
I had this exact conversation last night about the extent to which, look, there are many, many questions and conversations you can have about the actions of not Jewish people, but the Israeli state.
Of course.
Many, many. And I think some of them over the years, I'm going to say, have been abhorrent. I think they have been. Some of them have been reactive to attacks that they have been under themselves, which make them more understandable. There is a fair and reasonable conversation to be had about that. But the argument I was having last night was about the fact that when it was Muslim on Muslim deaths and genocide, there is nowhere near the scale of the protests that we see.
Yemen, Sudan.
There have been protests, but and they said, well, this person said to me, there have been protests. Of course there have been protests. I said, okay, but have they ever been on a weekly basis and on the scale that they are for this? And the answer is absolutely not.
Tibetans.
No. Yeah, there are so many examples in history where that's happened, and it's not a sort of the worst game of top trumps, but what it is just a point being made about the virtuing and the hypocrisy around some of this, and whether the Jewish people or the Israeli state rather, which of course Jewish people are massively tied up within, are held to a higher standard of account.
Oh, 100% they are. And what I find interesting about this young woman is, as she's allowed to go about and do whatever she wants in our society, she can do that because we are a free and democratic society. I wonder if she'd managed to protest quite so well if she were in Iran, without a headscarf, I might add, or if she were in Palestine.
Are we responsible? Someone has already texted me saying, how can you condemn social media when you're actually giving these idiots oxygen? I mean, is there a wider conversation to be had about, because Just Stop Oil, there is also that conversation about them, isn't there, about should we
ignore them?
Yeah, should we turn our backs? Should we say, actually, when we see them, just turn our backs on them and go, well, actually, we don't care what you're doing? And you sort of feed the beast, don't you?
As a parent, I do work to the mantra that you promote what you permit, and that's absolutely true.
So explain that.
Well, so if you permit an action, a behaviour, the person doing it will continue with it because you've allowed it. So you are promoting what you permitted them to do. So your argument about showing these and social media is exactly that. We are allowing these people to do this. This isn't protest. This is vandalism.
But then one of where the debate is, I think, in this is that one of the big arguments, do you remember when there were the anti-lockdown protests?
Yes.
And I
went on them.
They were not a million months away from the Black Lives Matter protests. Black Lives Matter protests got a huge amount of coverage. Yes. The anti-lockdown protests didn't. So going back to your argument, one of the gripes that was had about the anti-lockdown protests was that the media wasn't giving them the publicity. If you were on that protest, you wanted that publicity. So is that not a contradiction, that when you agree with a protest, I want the publicity, when I disagree, I don't
We
want it?
weren't disagreeing. We weren't saying we must be covered. We were saying, why are you treating things differently? That's a different conversation. Why would they promote the Black Lives Matter marches, but not the lockdown? If you're going to do it for one, then do it for another.
But if we're talking about protests in general, then sometimes it's going to be a protest one, not necessarily you, but one agrees with. Sometimes it's going to be a protest that one disagrees with.
Yeah.
What is the threshold for social media companies and the media to look at those protests and give them oxygen? Because there are going to be many people who completely disagreed with the lockdown protests.
Yep.
There are going to be many people who agreed with them and thought that they should have been shown and that there should have been more coverage given to them.
I think it's very wrong that the protests that are going on all over Europe every single day by the farmers are not really being shown on the media. So it's wrong, because if we're going to show one thing, we must show another. But this is about the news agenda and not allowing people...
Why are some sexier than others? And do you think there's a bias?
I don't think it's about sexy. I think there's government influence on our media, things that they want to get out there, things that they don't. Farmers' protests perhaps are more in the Remainers camp, sorry, the Brexiteers camp, so they're not showing those because we're now seeing unhappiness across the whole of Europe. I don't know. But actually, I don't care if it's covered or not. What I care about is vandalism and the policing of it. What's going to happen to this young woman? Has she been arrested? Will she go to prison?
And does it reflect on some of our media, probably slightly more of our media than less, you maybe disagree, I'm waiting for the furore, being right-wing? Because, no, because, look at things like the newspapers like the Daily Mail, who are not right-wing, I think right-wing is wrong, but centre-right.
Yes.
Because centre-right will go for something that is outrage, that will be outrage. And a left-wing protest, it might be that one thinks, right, a left-wing protest, all our media is lefties, and that's why it's being shown. I wonder whether it's not that. It's just that outrage sells papers. And if you see a Daily Mail headline about a protest you agree with, you might go, oh, well, I agree with that, I know all about it. But if it's something that, our statues being desecrated, you might pick up the paper and buy it.
I don't know. I think if you look at our newspapers... Sorry, I'm struggling here.
Yeah.
I think if you look at our newspapers, almost all of them, apart from, I think, 2 exceptions, are centre-right. And they're not covering the farmers very much either.
Yeah, but that's because it wouldn't sell, because the readership is more likely to agree with what the farmers are doing, so it's not going to actually sell the papers, whereas something you are furious and disagree with, i.e. a statue or a painting being vandalised, will make you pick up. Outrage sells more than agreement.
Yeah, you see, I would like to know what's going on in Europe with the farmers and see if our farmers are the same. So different people like different things.
Will that make the punter... I mean, you answer it. You're the punter. I'm just throwing out that perspective. But I just think that there is an argument to say that outrage sells more. So therefore, Just Stop Oil, closing our roads, inconveniencing you, ruining your life is probably going to make you pick up a newspaper more than a protest that you generally agree with and don't have much more to say about. I don't know. Am I right? Am I wrong? And what do you think about the obligation when it comes to the media, but more social media companies? Because whether the media covers it or not, social media is sort of the beginning, where it is, square one.